The dust had not settled on the road through Harding Flats when Isaac Monroe first saw her, and something inside his chest cracked open like parched earth after a long-awaited rain. She was sitting at the edge of the main thoroughfare in the small cattle town of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, her back pressed against the rough-hewn post of what had once been a feed store before it went bankrupt and shuttered its doors. Her dress, which had once been a fine cornflower blue, was now faded and stained with the red clay of the Texas hill country. Her dark hair, which looked like it had once been carefully pinned, hung loose around her shoulders in tangled waves. Her hands were folded in her lap with a kind of deliberate stillness, the way a person holds themselves together when they are afraid that if they move too quickly, everything will fall apart. Isaac had ridden into Redemption Creek that afternoon on business that was simple enough. He needed to restock his supplies, check in with the sheriff about a fence dispute on the northern edge of his land, and then ride the 12 miles back to his homestead before dark. He had a life that was quiet and ordered and mostly solitary, and he had come to understand that solitude as a kind of companion in its own right, steady and uncomplaining. But something made him slow his horse as he passed the woman by the feed store post. It was not just that she looked exhausted, though she did. It was not just that her cheekbones were too sharp beneath the shadows of her face, though they were. It was the way she was watching the town around her. The men loading wagons, the women crossing from the general store to the dressmaker's shop, the children chasing a dog through the dirt, watching it all with a kind of hollow hunger that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with not belonging anywhere in the world. Isaac Monroe was 31 years old that October, a man of steady hands and careful words, and he had seen enough hardship in his life to recognize it in another person's bones. He reined in his horse, a paint mare named Clara, and stepped down from the saddle in one practiced motion. The woman did not look up right away. She was staring at a spot somewhere in the middle distance, her jaw set with a quiet determination that made him think she had spent considerable energy that day simply deciding not to cry. "Afternoon," Isaac said, keeping his voice easy and unthreatening, the way he would speak near a skittish animal. She looked up then. Her eyes were dark brown and very direct, and in them he saw something that surprised him, not fear exactly, but a kind of wary measuring, as though she were calculating whether he was worth the effort of a response. "Afternoon," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected and steady, but there was a slight rough quality to it that he recognized. He had heard that quality in his own voice once after 3 days in the desert with half a canteen. Dehydration, hunger. "You all right?" He asked, not because he thought she was, but because he wanted to give her the chance to decide what she was willing to say. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair gone slightly long at the collar, and pale gray eyes that people sometimes found unnerving because of how still they were. He wore a worn canvas duster and working clothes, nothing fancy, and his boots showed the honest scuff of daily labor. "I am managing," she said, in a tone that suggested she was not entirely certain this was true. Isaac nodded slowly. "I'm going to get a meal at the Caldwell house before I ride back out," he said. "I'd be grateful for the company if you're not otherwise occupied." It was the right thing to say, he thought, not an offer of charity delivered like an accusation. Not the pointed question of why she was sitting in the dirt against a closed feed store. Just an invitation, plain and simple. She looked at him again with those measuring eyes, and he watched the calculation happen. "I don't have money for a meal," she said, and she said it with a kind of flat dignity that made clear she was not asking for anything, only stating a fact so there would be no confusion. "I didn't ask you to pay for it," he said simply, and waited. The woman, Edna Aldridge, though he did not yet know her name, pressed her lips together and looked away from him for a moment, at the dusty street and the people moving through it. He could see her throat move as she swallowed, and he thought he understood something about pride then that he had not understood before, or perhaps had simply not felt this particularly before. He understood that pride was not a luxury of the comfortable. It was sometimes the only thing a person in desperate circumstances had left to stand on. "All right," she said at last, and accepted his offered hand to rise from the ground. When she stood, she swayed slightly, just slightly, hardly noticeable, and Isaac kept his hand steady under hers until she had her balance. He did not remark upon it. They walked together into the Caldwell house, which served as both a modest hotel and the nearest thing Redemption Creek had to a restaurant, where a large-chested woman named Mabel Pratt ran the kitchen with an iron authority and a surprisingly good hand with a Dutch oven. The dining room was half full at that hour, with ranch hands and a couple of merchants and a traveling preacher working through his Bible in the corner. The smell of roasting meat and baked bread hit the air the moment the door opened, and Isaac heard the woman beside him make a sound barely audible, quickly suppressed. That was not quite a gasp and not quite a moan, but somewhere between the two. The sound of someone who has been without something fundamental for a very long time. He had been hungry before, genuinely hungry, and so he understood the quality of that small sound in a way that settled something in his chest. They sat at a table near the window, and Mabel herself came out to take their order, eyeing Edna with the frank appraisal of a woman who had seen a great deal of the world from behind her kitchen door. "What'll it be?" Mabel asked. "2 plates of whatever's hot," Isaac said. "And coffee and bread." Mabel nodded and disappeared back through the swinging kitchen door. Isaac took off his hat and set it on the empty chair beside him. The woman across the table was looking out the window with that same distant expression she had worn outside, as though she were still not entirely sure she was permitted to be here. "I'm Isaac Monroe," he said. "I have a homestead out on the Caldera Road, 12 miles north of here." She looked back at him. Something shifted in her expression, a decision being made. "Edna Aldridge," she said. "I came from Abilene, before that from Ohio originally." "Long way from either place," he observed. "Yes," she agreed. He did not push for more. Mabel brought the bread first, a whole half-loaf still warm from the oven, and set it between them with a small crock of butter. He watched Edna look at the bread with an expression she was visibly working to control, and he reached out, cut 2 slices, and passed one across to her as naturally as if they had been doing this together for years. She ate the bread slowly, deliberately, with the careful restraint of someone who knew that eating too quickly after going without would make her sick. He pretended to look out the window while she ate, giving her what privacy he could in the close quarters of the dining room. "I haven't eaten," she said quietly when she had finished the slice, "in 2 days." The words were delivered simply, without drama, as though she were reporting a fact about the weather. But Isaac felt them land in him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction. 2 days. He looked back at her. She was watching him with that same steady, measuring look, and he had the sense that she was waiting to see what he would do with the information, whether he would turn it into something condescending or prying or falsely sympathetic, whether he would make her feel worse for having said it. "That's a long time," he said, and meant it, and let it be only what it was. She nodded once. When Mabel came out with the 2 plates, pork roast with gravy, boiled potatoes, a side of greens cooked down with salt pork, Isaac looked at his plate and then at Edna's and made a decision so quickly and naturally that it surprised him. He switched the plates, giving her his, which was the fuller of the 2, and pulled her smaller plate to his side of the table. "That one's yours," he said, nodding toward the plate in front of her, the one piled higher, the one with the better cut of the pork. She looked at the plate, then at him, then back at the plate. "Isaac," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and it sounded different than he expected, careful, like a word she wasn't sure yet she had the right to say. "That's your plate." "The food's the same," he said easily and picked up his fork. She studied him for a moment longer with those serious dark eyes, and then she said, so quietly he almost missed it, "Thank you." He nodded as though it were nothing, though it was not nothing at all. She ate with that same deliberate restraint at first, but he kept his eyes largely on his own plate and the street outside, and after a few minutes she relaxed into the meal, and he was glad for it. He found himself eating more slowly than usual, making his own portions last, and not once regretting that he had given her the better half of the meal, even as the hour stretched on, and his stomach noted the relative scarcity of what remained on his side of the table. He had gone hungry before for worse reasons, and this was no hardship at all. They talked slowly through the meal, the way people talk when they are being careful with each other. He learned that Edna was 27 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from a small town in Ohio, and that she had come west 2 years prior with a man named Gerald Aldridge, whom she had married in the belief that he was a man of honest ambitions and better character than he ultimately proved to have. She told it plainly, without excessive bitterness, though he could hear the shape of the bitterness underneath, worn smooth by time like river stones. Gerald Aldridge had come to Texas with dreams of running cattle on land he had no money to actually purchase, and when that dream met the hard reality of the Texas landscape and his own lack of discipline, he had turned first to whiskey and then to gambling, and had eventually managed to lose everything they had brought west, including the small savings Edna had inherited from her mother. 6 months ago, Gerald Aldridge had gotten himself killed in a card game in a town called Sutton Wells, 40 miles east, leaving Edna with nothing but a boarding house bill she couldn't pay and a reputation that made it hard to find respectable work in the small town she had passed through since. "Widow of a gambling man," she said without self-pity. "People make assumptions." "Do they?" Isaac said, and it was not a question. "They do." She looked at him directly. "You might too, once I'm no longer in front of you." "I might," he acknowledged, which surprised her. He could see it in the slight widening of her eyes. "But I find I'm not much inclined to think about people when they're not in front of me. There's plenty of real information in the here and now without needing to fill in the gaps with guesswork." She was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual way to think," she said at last. "Is it?" He considered. "It seems like the simplest kind of sense to me." Mabel came and refilled the coffee, and the afternoon light through the window shifted toward gold, and they talked on. Isaac told her about his land, 240 acres of rolling Texas hill country that he had been working for 4 years, since buying it from a man who had given up and gone back east. He ran a small cattle operation and kept a garden, and had recently begun growing some wheat on the North 40, which the soil seemed to favor. He told her about the house, which he had largely built himself, and which was solid and dry and had a good well. He did not tell her, though he was aware of thinking it, that the house felt very large for one person, and had for some time. He told her about his own history, more briefly born in Virginia, moved west after the war, worked on various spreads in Kansas and New Mexico before finding the land outside Redemption Creek and deciding it was close enough to what he had been looking for. "What were you looking for?" she asked. He thought about this. "Somewhere I could make something that was mine," he said. "Something that would last." She nodded slowly, and he had the sense she understood this. Not just the words of it, but the specific quality of need behind it. By the time they had finished their coffee, the dining room had emptied out around them and the light outside was turning orange, which meant he had less than 2 hours before dark would make the road back to his homestead genuinely unpleasant. He put the question to himself plainly. What was she going to do tonight? She had no money, which meant no room at the hotel. The nights in October in the hill country could drop cold. The next town of any size was 15 miles away. Redemption Creek had no charity house, and its one church was run by a minister whose goodness, in Isaac's estimation, was fairly theoretical. He turned his hat in his hands and looked at the table and made a decision. "I have a spare room in my house," he said. "Clean, private, a real bed. I'm offering it as a place to stay while you get yourself sorted, with no expectations of anything in return and no conditions. You'd have your privacy and your independence and full use of the kitchen. I'm not home most of the day." He paused. "I recognize that's an unusual offer from a stranger. You don't have to take it, but I wanted you to have the information." Edna Aldridge looked at him for a long time. He met her gaze and held it because he knew what she was doing. She was reading him, looking for the angle, the hidden price, the thing that would come due later. He let her look. "You truly have no expectations." She said, "None," he said. "I know what you'd be risking by accepting. I don't take that lightly." She was quiet again for what felt like a very long time. Outside, a wagon rolled past with a great creaking of wheels, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and the light continued its slow descent toward evening. "All right, Isaac Monroe," she said at last. "I'll accept your offer." The ride out to the homestead was made in the last long hours of daylight. Isaac on Clara and Edna seated before him, since she had no horse of her own. Her bag, a single traveling case worn at the corners tied to the back of the saddle. They did not talk much on the ride, but the silence was not uncomfortable. The hill country rolled around them, golden and amber and brown, the live oaks standing in their knots and clusters, the cedar cutting its sharp smell across the cooling air. The homestead came into view as the sun touched the western ridge, a solid limestone house with a wide front porch, a good barn, a chicken coop, a garden plot gone to its autumn rest, and two large live oaks shading the east side of the house. It was not grand, but it was well made and honest, and it looked like a place that intended to be there for a long time. "It's beautiful," Edna said, and he heard in her voice that she meant it without calculation, and something in him that had been held tight for a long while loosened slightly. He showed her the spare room. It was simply furnished: a rope bed with a good quilt, a washstand, a small chest of drawers, and told her where the kitchen was, and where he kept the food stores and the water and the extra blankets. He got a fire going in the main room's hearth before he saw to the horse, because the night was coming cold, and when he came back inside from the barn she was standing in the kitchen with her back to him, and he could tell from the set of her shoulders that she had been crying, though she turned to face him with a composed expression and dry eyes. "There's cornmeal and salt pork if you're hungry again," he said, as if he hadn't noticed. "I am," she said simply. He cooked that night. He was a plain but competent cook, the product of years of feeding himself, and they ate together at the kitchen table. And this time the conversation came more easily, as though the road and the fading daylight and the fire had all conspired to relax the careful formality of the afternoon. She asked him about the cattle operation, and he told her about the spring calving and the summer market run to San Antonio. She told him about her years of schooling in Ohio, about her father's library, about the books she missed most. He told her he had a crate of books in the back room and she could help herself to any of them. She looked at him as though he had offered her something of great value, and he supposed, for a woman who had spent 2 years in rough circumstances, he had. That night, after she had retired to the spare room and he had banked the fire and gone to his own bed, Isaac Monroe lay in the dark and thought about Edna Aldridge with the same serious attention he gave to any important thing in his life. He thought about the way she had eaten the bread carefully, with that restrained need. He thought about the 2 days she had gone without food, and the flat dignity with which she had reported this fact. He thought about the way she had measured him across the table with her dark eyes and decided, despite every reason for caution, to trust him. He thought these things, and felt the familiar ache of his solitary house around him, and recognized that the ache was somewhat less than it had been the night before, and tried to think clearly about what that meant. In the morning, he was up before dawn as was his habit, and came into the kitchen to find the stove already lit, and a pot of coffee already made, and Edna Aldridge standing at the kitchen window with a cup in both hands, watching the pale pre-dawn light come up over the eastern hills. "You don't have to do that," he said, gesturing at the stove. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I'm not very good at being still. I need to be useful." He understood that absolutely. "All right," he said, and poured himself a cup of her coffee, which was better than his own, and they watched the dawn come in together. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised him with how natural it felt. Edna took over the kitchen without being asked and proved to be a genuinely skilled cook, producing meals from his plain stores that bore no resemblance to the serviceable but unimaginative things he had been making himself. She baked bread twice a week and kept the house in a clean and ordered state that he had never managed entirely on his own. She mended things. She organized his chaotic collection of receipts and correspondence. She was, he discovered, extremely competent and extremely practical, and she applied herself to the work of the homestead with a focused energy that suggested she was grateful for the outlet. He, for his part, tried to make clear without making it explicit that her presence was not a burden or a charity project, but simply a good thing. He asked her opinion on the garden layout for the spring and listened seriously to what she said, because she knew more about growing things than he did, having helped her father's kitchen garden as a child. He brought in an extra chair to the porch, and they took to sitting there in the evenings after dinner, him with a pipe, and her with whatever book she was working through, and the silence between them was one of the most comfortable he had ever known. He was careful not to assume anything or presume anything. She was a woman who had been badly served by a man who had taken her trust and wasted it, and Isaac Monroe had enough respect for the weight of that to move slowly and honestly. But he was also a man who knew his own mind, and his mind was increasingly engaged with Edna Aldridge. It was about 3 weeks into her stay that the subject of her future came up for the first time in any serious way. They had ridden into Redemption Creek together. She needed cloth for a dress and he needed hardware, and while he was at the smithy, she had gone to the general store. When he came to find her, he discovered her in conversation with a woman named Clara Hatch, the wife of one of the larger landowners in the county, who was telling Edna with an air of sweet authority that the town did not have much use for unattached widows, and perhaps she had considered moving on to a larger settlement. He came in at the tail end of this, just in time to see Edna's face go smooth and composed in the way he had come to recognize as her shield, and to hear her say, quietly and pleasantly, "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Hatch. I'll give it all the consideration it deserves," which was, he suspected, approximately none. Clara Hatch saw him in the doorway and said something about him harboring waifs and strays that was clearly designed to be overheard, and then she swept out of the store. There was a silence. "I'm sorry about that," Isaac said. "Don't be," Edna said, still looking at the bolts of cloth on the shelf in front of her. "She's not wrong that my situation is irregular. Her opinion of your situation isn't any of my concern," he said. Edna looked at him then, quickly, with something he couldn't quite read in her expression. He carried her packages to the wagon and they drove back to the homestead in a somewhat more charged silence than usual, and that evening on the porch he asked her what she was thinking about her future, and meant it as a genuine question, not an eviction notice. "I've been thinking about it," she said, looking out at the darkening hills. "I have some skill as a seamstress. I thought perhaps I could set up a small sewing work in one of the towns, Fredericksburg or perhaps Careville, if I could earn enough in the next few months to make a start." "That's a solid plan," he said. "But I would need to save something first," she said. "And I'm aware I've been here nearly a month and I've given you nothing in return for—" "Stop there," he said, not unkindly. "You've kept this house and cooked every meal and done enough work around here to be worth more than room and board 10 times over. You don't owe me anything." She looked at him with that measuring quality again, and then she said, carefully, "Isaac, what do you actually want from this arrangement?" It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer, and he respected her too much to give her anything else. "Honestly," he said. "Please," she said. He turned to look at her fully, his gray eyes steady in the lamplight spilling from the window. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because I need a cook and housekeeper, because you're the most interesting person I've met in 4 years and I like having you here, and I think," he paused, choosing his words, "I think there might be something worth building between us if you were willing. But that's a separate conversation from your plans for your own life, and I wouldn't want you to feel any obligation on account of it." Edna was very still for a moment. "You think there might be something worth building," she repeated slowly. "I do," he said. "You've known me a month," she said. "I have," he agreed. "And in that month I've seen enough to know the quality of what you are. But I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I just wanted you to have the information, the same as I did that afternoon at the Caldwell house." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, but the shape of one. "You are a very unusual man, Isaac Monroe," she said. "So I've been told," he said, and picked up his pipe again, and they sat in the comfortable dark and listened to the coyotes calling on the far ridge. And nothing was decided that night, but something had shifted nonetheless. The way the first warm day in February shifts, something in the earth even before anything has bloomed. November came in cold and clear, and with it the particular beauty of the hill country in late autumn, the golden light lying flat and long across the land, the cedar smoke rising from chimneys, the last of the pecan harvest coming in. Isaac had a neighbor, a man named Amos Treadwell, who ran a ranch 4 miles to the south and who was, by some significant margin, the most talkative man in Hayes County. Amos appeared at the homestead one morning in early November on the pretext of returning a borrowed post-hole digger, and spent 2 hours on the porch drinking coffee and conducting a masterful survey of all available information about Edna Aldridge, none of which he obtained, because Isaac answered his questions in the brevity of a man who had thought about what information was his to share and determined that very little of it was. But Amos was not unkind, and Edna came out to refill the coffee, and he spoke to her warmly and without any of Clara Hatch's social positioning. And when he left, he shook Isaac's hand and said quietly, "She's got good eyes, Isaac. The kind of good that doesn't go bad." Isaac thought about this for some time after Amos's wagon had disappeared around the bend. The moment things shifted between them in a way that was undeniable came on a night in mid-November, when a norther blew down from the plains with the sudden violence. Those storms were known for dropping the temperature 20 degrees in an hour and howling around the eaves of the house with a sound like the world's displeasure. Isaac had gone out to secure the barn before the worst of it hit, and he came back to find Edna in the kitchen with the stove going and a kettle on, and a pile of extra quilts she had pulled from the chest, sorting through them with the brisk competence of someone preparing for a siege. "I thought you might need warming up when you came in," she said, without looking at him. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his coat wet with the first slant rain of the storm, and felt something happen in his chest that he did not entirely have words for. She turned and saw him standing there and came directly to him and began working the buttons of his coat, practically, without any self-consciousness, the way you help someone who needed help, and he was very still while she did this, acutely aware of her fingers and the smell of her hair and the nearness of her in the warm kitchen. She got the coat unbuttoned and peeled it off his shoulders and hung it by the stove to dry, and then she poured him a cup of hot coffee and put it in his hands and looked up at him. Something moved between them in the warm light, quiet and certain, like the turning of a page. He set the coffee down on the table behind him and lifted one hand to push a strand of hair back from her face, very gently, and she did not move away. She was looking up at him with those steady dark eyes, and in them he saw not fear and not calculation, but something that looked, with a warmth that moved through him like sunlight, like welcome. "Edna," he said, "just her name, just that." "I know," she said softly. He leaned down and kissed her, carefully and honestly, and the storm threw rain against the window in a great gust, and the stove ticked with heat, and he felt her hands close in the fabric of his shirt, and everything outside that kitchen seemed very far away and not particularly important. When he lifted his head, she was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, unguarded, the careful composure entirely down, something bright and a little fragile showing through. "I don't want to go to Careville and set up a sewing shop," she said. "No," he said. "No," she said. "I want to stay here." He covered her hands where they rested on his chest. "Then stay," he said. They stood there in the kitchen while the norther howled outside and the lamp threw its warm gold light around them. And it was one of those moments that a person carries with them for the rest of their life. Not dramatic, not grand, but entirely and undeniably real. The weeks that followed were a kind of revelation for both of them. Isaac Monroe, who had built a life of careful solitude around a habit of self-sufficiency, discovered that he was not, it turned out, entirely suited to solitude. He had simply never found the right company before. He found that having Edna in his house changed the quality of every hour. The mornings were better because she made coffee with some skill he had never managed, yes, but more than that because she was at the table when he came in, with her book or her sewing or simply her hands around the cup, and the particular kind of alone that had lived in him since he was young was less present in her company. And he noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you had been hearing so long. It had become the wallpaper of your days. For Edna, the weeks were a kind of careful, frightened unwinding, the slow process of trusting again, of allowing herself to believe that what she saw in Isaac Monroe was what was actually there, and not the surface of something that would eventually reveal itself as different. She had married a man who had shown her one face and lived another, and the damage of that was not easily undone, no matter how warm and genuinely steady the man in front of her proved to be. She was honest with him about this. "I'm still sometimes waiting," she told him one evening, when they had been sitting close on the porch, and she had finally given words to the thing she had been carrying. "Waiting for what?" he asked. "For you to be something other than what you appear," she said. "It's not reasonable of me, I know that, but the expectation is there." He was quiet for a moment, digesting this with the serious attention he gave to everything she said. "That seems like a fairly sensible response to what you went through," he said at last. "It doesn't bother you that I'm still half expecting you to disappoint me." "It would bother me more if you weren't careful," he said. "Trust should be built, not assumed. I'd rather earn yours slowly than have you extend it prematurely." He paused. "I'll just keep on being what I am, and you can keep watching, and eventually perhaps the expectation will wear out from lack of evidence to support it." She laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind he was coming to love the sound of. "That is a very practical approach to emotional rehabilitation," she said. "It's the only kind I know," he said, and she took his hand on the arm of her chair and held it, and they sat with the stars coming out above the hill country in their brilliant autumn abundance. In December, Isaac took Edna to Redemption Creek for the annual Founders' Day gathering, a modest affair, but the social event of the season for the county, involving a communal meal in the town square, some music, and the kind of deliberate community display that small settlements use to reassure themselves of their own existence. Edna wore her best dress, which she had remade and pressed, and she wore her hair up in a careful arrangement, and she walked into the gathering on Isaac's arm with that quality he had come to associate with her presence in any room, a kind of composed, attentive dignity that was not arrogance and not vanity, but simply the bearing of someone who knew their own worth even when the world around them had occasionally disputed it. Clara Hatch was there, of course, in a new dress that announced itself, and she watched Isaac and Edna arrive together with an expression that cycled through surprise and disapproval before landing on a studied neutrality. The Reverend, a mild-mannered man named Oakes who was considerably more genuinely Christian than his predecessor, came and spoke to Edna warmly and asked after her circumstances, and seemed genuinely pleased when she described herself as well-situated. Amos Treadwell and his wife, a compact and direct woman named Florence, intercepted them near the food tables, and Florence Treadwell took Edna's arm with the confident friendliness of a woman who had already decided, on the basis of Amos's report, that she liked Edna Aldridge, and marched her off to meet several other women, which left Isaac and Amos standing together with their plates. "Well," Amos said, watching Edna laugh at something Florence had said, the sound of it carrying clearly across the square, "she fits in fine." She does, Isaac agreed with a simplicity that contained a great deal. Amos looked at him sideways. You going to ask her, he said. Isaac ate a piece of cornbread. I'm working up to it, he said. Amos snorted. Isaac Monroe, you built a house largely by yourself with your own hands in 4 months. You ran a cattle herd single-handed through a drought year. I have watched you face down a bull that outweighed your horse and do it without blinking. Are you telling me you're afraid to talk to a woman? Not afraid, Isaac said. Just trying to get it right. Amos shook his head with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully identified something. Well, get it right soon, he said, before someone in this county with less sense steps in ahead of you. Isaac looked across the square to where Edna was standing in the circle of Florence Treadwell's lively company, her head tipped back slightly in laughter, and thought that Amos was not wrong, and also thought that no, actually, he did not believe anyone would step in, because Edna Aldridge was, if he had read her correctly, not especially available to anyone except the specific person she had already decided on, and he had reason to believe that person was him. But he wanted to ask her properly, and he wanted to ask her at the right time, and he was working on this. The right time came on the kind of clear, cold December evening that existed in the hill country like a reward for the difficulty of summer. The sky, an extraordinary deep blue overhead with a hard, bright full moon riding above the limestone ridges, the air so cold and clean it felt like drinking from a good well. He had ridden out after supper to check on the north cattle, and had come back to find Edna standing on the porch looking up at the moon, her shawl pulled close, her breath coming in small clouds. He put the horse in the barn and came up to stand beside her. I was thinking, she said without turning, about Ohio winters. They were gray and bitter and went on forever. I don't think I've ever seen a sky like this in winter. Even after 2 years here, it still surprises me. I know what you mean, he said. The sky out here is different. They stood looking at it together for a while. Then he said, Edna, I want to ask you something. She turned to look at him. The moonlight was extraordinary on her face, not flattering in any soft, poetic way but simply illuminating, showing her as she actually was, sharp-cheeked and dark-eyed and entirely herself. I'd like to marry you, he said. I want to be clear that I'm asking, not assuming. And I want to be equally clear about why. Not because it's the sensible arrangement for 2 people sharing a house, not out of charity or obligation or convenience, because I love you, Edna. I have been watching you for 2 months now with full attention and I know what I see. I love who you are. I would like to spend my life with you if that is a thing you could want. She looked at him for a long moment, and in the moonlight he could see the slight trembling of her lower lip that she was controlling with great precision. You told me, she said softly, that you would keep on being what you are until my expectations wore out from lack of evidence. I did, he said. They have, she said. I have been watching you too, Isaac Monroe. I have been watching you for 2 months and I have not once found anything that contradicts what you appear to be. Her voice was very steady and very quiet. I love you. I didn't expect to. I wasn't looking for it, but there it is. She reached out and took hold of the front of his coat with both hands the way she had that first night in the storm and tilted her face up toward his. Yes, she said. I would like very much to marry you. He put his arms around her and held her in the cold, moonlit night, and she pressed her face against the side of his neck, and the moon threw their shadows long and clear across the porch boards, and the coyotes called on the far ridge, and the hill country held them in its ancient limestone arms. They were married in February of 1883, in the small stone church on the edge of Redemption Creek, with Reverend Oakes officiating and Amos and Florence Treadwell as witnesses, and a small gathering of neighbors and townspeople who had gradually, over the course of the winter months, adjusted their view of Edna Aldridge from something vaguely suspicious to something admiring. Edna wore a dress she had made herself from ivory wool, plain and well cut, and she carried a small bunch of the early flowering things that had come up at the south end of the garden, pale yellow and white. She walked to the front of that stone church without anyone to give her away, because she had learned something in the years between Ohio and here about belonging to herself, and she stood beside Isaac Monroe and said her vows in a clear, steady voice that did not waver at a single word. Isaac, who was not in general a man given to emotional display, had to look at the back wall of the church at one point because his throat had become inconveniently tight. Florence Treadwell, who noticed everything, smiled from the front pew. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the Caldwell house where Mabel Pratt had made a cake that was, by general agreement, exceptional, and toasts were made. And Amos Treadwell made a speech that was both too long and genuinely heartfelt. And the winter afternoon wore on in warmth and good company until they rode home together to the homestead on the Caldera Road, Isaac and Edna, husband and wife, in the cold twilight. "Are you happy?" he asked as they came in sight of the house. She looked at him with those dark eyes above the high collar of her coat. "I am so happy," she said, "that it frightens me a little." "That's all right," he said. "I'll keep it safe." She reached out and took his hand, right there on the road with the cold coming down and the lights of the house ahead. "I know you will," she said. Spring came to the hill country in 1883 with an extraordinary thoroughness, and the homestead on the Caldera Road bloomed. Edna's garden, which she had taken over with the organized enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, produced in abundance tomatoes and peppers and corn and squash, beans on their poles, sweet potatoes in the south bed. She expanded the herb border along the front of the house and planted a long row of sunflowers along the east fence that would stand in August like a congregation of pleased faces. Isaac's wheat crop on the North 40 responded to the good spring rains with a density that surprised even him, and the cattle operation had a strong calving season. He hired a young man from Redemption Creek named Billy Prout, who was 16 and hardworking, and had recently been turned loose by a pair of parents who had their own financial difficulties to manage. And Billy slept in the tack room of the barn and ate supper with them every evening, and proved to be, beneath a shell of determined toughness, essentially kind. Edna taught Billy to read properly. She discovered in the third week of his employment that he had only a sketchy literacy, and took this as a problem requiring immediate correction. And Billy submitted to these lessons with a resistance that was entirely performed and a genuine engagement that made progress fast. "He's smart," Edna reported to Isaac one evening. "He's been taught to think he isn't, but he's genuinely smart." "I know," Isaac said. "That's why I hired him." Edna looked at him. "You knew he couldn't read well. I suspected he had gaps, but I watched how he solved the problem with the stuck wagon gate last week. That took real ingenuity. He reached for the bread. The reading seemed like something that could be addressed." Edna was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are constantly being more than people expect you to be, Isaac." He looked up at her. "I don't follow." "I know," she said, smiling. "That's what I mean." In the spring, they heard more about the situation with the Comanche and Apache peoples who had been forced onto reservations in the years preceding. The long-winded winds of policy from Washington that had for decades treated the original people of this land as obstacles to be removed, and the continued injustice of watching those communities confined to land that was a fraction of what they had lived upon for generations. Isaac had grown up knowing some of this history, had worked for a stretch in New Mexico where it was impossible to be ignorant of it, and he had his views, which were quieter than the loudest voices in either direction but considerably more seriously considered. Edna, who had grown up with a schoolteacher father who considered education a moral obligation rather than merely a practical one, had even stronger views and was less inclined to keep them quiet. There was a morning in Redemption Creek when she heard a man at the general store talking about the Apache with a contempt that was both casual and profound, and she said something into the silence of the store that was brief, factual, and so precisely aimed that the man had no adequate response and eventually left. Isaac, who had been examining a length of rope by the door, did not say anything, but caught her eye on the way out and let the smile show. "You agree with me?" she said on the road home. "I do," he said. "You didn't say anything in there," she said. "You had it well in hand," he said. "And you said it better than I would have. I've found that the kind of man who talks that way doesn't much hear it coming from another man. But from you," he considered, "I think perhaps it actually landed." She thought about this. That's a very sophisticated observation about the dynamics of prejudice. "It's practical observation about who listens to who under what circumstances," he said. "I don't have any particular sophistication." "Isaac," she said, in the tone she used when he was being willfully modest, and he laughed. Summer was full and hot and good, the way a good summer in the hill country is, relentless and golden and full of the hard, satisfying work of managing a living thing as it grows. The cattle and the wheat and the garden all demanding constant attention, and giving back the particular satisfaction of things that grow because you have tended them. It was in late July that Edna told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table over coffee, in the same direct and unadorned way she told him most important things, simply, clearly, watching his face. He went very still for a moment, and then something happened in his expression that she had not seen before, a kind of slow, unguarded opening, as though a door that had been carefully maintained had swung wide. His gray eyes were very bright. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his. He did not say anything for a moment. She could feel the warmth of his hands and see the particular quality of his face when something had gone past his defenses, and she thought, not for the first time, that whatever happened for the rest of her life, she would not trade this, the specific reality of this man, his steadiness and his depth and the way he looked at her with complete attention, as though she were the most interesting landscape he had ever encountered. "Are you well?" he asked. "Is everything—" "I feel fine," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but fine. Florence Treadwell says that usually passes." "You've told Florence." "Florence guessed," Edna said, slightly amused. "She came by last Tuesday and took one look at me and said, and I quote, 'Edna Monroe, you are with child and you had better tell that husband of yours before he notices and says something clumsy.'" Isaac laughed, a genuine full laugh, the kind she had spent some months learning to produce in him and found she was still proud of every time. "That is very Florence," he said. "It really is," she agreed. He was still crouched beside her chair, holding her hands, and he pressed them both to his lips and held them there, and she rested her forehead briefly against the top of his head, and they stayed like that in the morning kitchen while the sunlight came in through the east window and the birds argued in the live oaks. Billy Prout, who came in from the barn at this juncture for his breakfast, took in the situation with commendable swiftness, quietly reversed direction, and went back to the barn for another 20 minutes, which demonstrated, Edna later remarked, exactly the kind of intelligence Isaac had correctly identified. The pregnancy was easy, as these things went. The morning tiredness faded in September, and Edna remained healthy and strong through the autumn, continuing to manage the house and the garden with the focused energy that was characteristic of her, though Isaac quietly rearranged certain tasks so that the most physically demanding ones were handled by himself or Billy without fanfare. She caught on to this, of course. She caught on to everything, and told him that she was not made of glass, and he told her he was well aware of that and was simply using the common sense appropriate to the circumstances, and she considered this and allowed it. Florence Treadwell came out to the homestead often in those months, which was ostensibly to help with the preparations, but was in practice largely an excuse for the two women to spend time together talking, which both of them clearly valued enormously. Isaac liked Florence. She was direct and capable and genuinely fond of Edna, and he liked what their friendship did for Edna, the way it connected her more deeply to the fabric of the community, gave her the kind of female companionship that he simply could not provide. On a cold, clear morning in late February of 1884, Almost exactly a year after their wedding, Edna gave birth to a son. He arrived in the small hours, with Florence in attendance and Isaac nearby, closer than Florence perhaps strictly preferred for a man's attendance at such affairs, but Edna had said she wanted him and that had settled it. It was a hard several hours. Isaac held her hand through it with the same quality of presence he brought to everything completely, without flinching, whatever was needed. When it was over and the baby announced his arrival with a considerable volume of opinion about the disruption of his situation, Florence placed the bundled infant in Isaac's arms, because Edna had fallen into an exhausted sleep almost immediately. Isaac held his son in the lamplight and felt the specific, overwhelming largeness of the moment with a humility that went all the way to his boots. "He's healthy," Florence said quietly, washing her hands at the basin. "Good lungs, clearly." "Clearly," Isaac agreed. Edna woke after an hour and he put the baby in her arms and sat on the edge of the bed and watched her look at their son with the expression he would think about for years afterward, that complete, immediate love, complicated by wonder and exhaustion and something fierce and fundamental. "James," she said. It was the name they had agreed on, James Henry Monroe, Henry for her father. "Hello, James." James Monroe regarded his mother with the unfocused intensity of the newborn and made a sound of ambiguous commentary. "He has your eyes," Edna said. "They're all blue at the start," Isaac said. "I know," she said, "but they'll be gray. I can already see it." She was right. By summer, James Monroe had his father's steady gray eyes, and by his first autumn he was crawling with the single-minded determination of someone who had decided the world needed to be more thoroughly investigated. The homestead on the Caldera Road expanded in those years with the natural accretion of a life being built. An additional room added to the house. The garden doubled in size. The cattle herd grown to a respectable number. Billy Prout moved from the tack room to his own small cabin built at the north edge of the property, where he was now a fully established hand who read voraciously, and had begun to correspond with Edna's former acquaintances about agricultural methods. Redemption Creek itself grew and shifted around them, new families arriving, a proper schoolhouse finally built in 1885, a second store opening, the Caldwell House replaced by a more ambitious hotel. The social landscape of the county adjusted and resettled, as social landscapes do, and Edna Monroe found herself, in the course of 3 years, moving from the woman about whom Clara Hatch had expressed concern to a person of some standing in the community. Not through any deliberate effort, but through the accumulated weight of being reliable, competent, honest, and genuinely interested in other people's well-being. She helped establish the school and taught there 2 mornings a week for the first 2 years, until the enrollment justified a full-time teacher. She kept a cabinet of medicines and practical medical knowledge that made her the first port of call for several families when illness came, because the nearest doctor was 20 miles away and she had her father's library and a practical mind. She was not sentimental about this work, but she cared about it, and the caring was visible. Isaac watched all of this with a quiet, steady pride that he did not always express in words, but expressed in 1,000 other ways. In the care he took to make her work possible, in the way he spoke of her to other men, in the way he looked at her across a crowded room with that particular gray-eyed attention that she had come to know as his specific language for things that went beyond words. They had disagreements, of course real ones, as any 2 people of strong character and genuine opinions will. About the cattle operation, about decisions regarding the land, about how firmly to respond to a boundary dispute with a neighbor to the west who was encroaching on their fence line. Edna was less inclined to wait and see than Isaac was, and Isaac was less inclined to sharp, immediate action than Edna, and these were genuine differences of temperament that produced genuine friction on occasion. But they had learned, in the particular school of living closely together, to disagree with respect and to resolve with honesty, and neither of them was the kind of person who held a grievance past its usefulness. There was something clean about how they fought, if you could call it that, two people who were paying genuine attention to each other, genuinely trying to get things right. In the spring of 1886, when James was 2 years old and full of specific opinions about every aspect of his existence, Edna told Isaac she was expecting again. "Another," he said. "Another," she confirmed. He looked at her across the kitchen table and smiled a slow, full smile that did not happen quickly, but when it arrived was worth the wait. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. "The house has room," he said, "and James needs someone to argue with who isn't us." "He argues with us quite thoroughly already," she said. "He does," Isaac agreed. "He takes after you." "He absolutely does not," she said, and then paused, considering. "He takes after both of us." "That is diplomatically and accurately stated," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1886 during a week of good clear weather that felt like a gift. They named her Ruth, and she arrived into the world with considerably less announcement than James had, and regarded her new circumstances with a thoughtful quiet that made Florence Treadwell say, on her first visit, "This one is going to be an observer." She was right. Ruth Monroe grew up watching everything and saying little and understanding more than anyone expected, which was a quality she had from both her parents. James and Ruth, 3 years apart, had the specific relationship of siblings who are very different in temperament, but share enough of their parents' character to fundamentally recognize each other. James was decisive and energetic and occasionally reckless, and Ruth watched his adventures with the composed attention of someone running a continuous evaluation. They were, Isaac thought, watching them from the porch one afternoon, genuinely good for each other. Billy Prout, by the later years of the decade, had become so thoroughly integrated into the operation of the homestead that he was less an employee than a partner in function if not in name. And Isaac had conversations with him about the future of the land, with the kind of directness appropriate to someone he trusted. Billy had by now taught himself, through Edna's initial instruction and his own subsequent ferocious reading, more about agricultural chemistry and soil management than anyone else in the county, and he applied this knowledge with a practical creativity that had increased the yield of the North 40 by a margin that made the investment in the additional room and cabin seem in retrospect very modest indeed. There were harder things too, woven into the good years, because the land and the times did not grant exemption from difficulty. There was a dry summer in 1887 that tested the cattle operation severely and required hard decisions about the herd. Isaac made them without sentiment and without panic, the same deliberateness he applied to everything, and they came through it without the devastating losses that ruined some of their neighbors. There was a winter illness that swept through the county in 1888, taking several of the older residents of Redemption Creek and keeping Edna and Isaac both, with Florence and Amos Treadwell, exhausted and watchful over several months as they did what they could with what they had. James had a bad fall from a horse in the summer of 1889 that kept him bedridden for 3 weeks with a broken arm and bruised ribs, which produced in Edna a contained but profound terror that she managed with great competence and enormous inner cost, and in Isaac a gravity that did not lift until the boy was up and moving with his characteristic energy again. But the hard things were proportionate to the good things, which was, Isaac thought, probably the best you could ask of a life. In the early spring of 1890, when Edna was 35 and Isaac was 39, they sat on the porch of the house they had made together on a warm evening with the country opening up around them in all its extravagant April green, and James was chasing something in the yard, and Ruth was sitting on the porch steps with a book, and Billy was somewhere on the north pasture they could hear the distant work of his presence, and the supper dishes were done. And the evening star was coming up over the eastern ridge. "Do you remember," Edna said, "the Caldwell house? Every detail," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I was trying so hard not to show it." "I know," he said. "Did it show?" "Some," he said honestly. "But what showed more was the pride, The fact that you sat there and told me you hadn't eaten for 2 days like you were simply reporting a fact about the road. He turned to look at her. That was the first thing I knew about you, and I thought this is a person of real character. Edna was quiet for a moment, looking out at James in the yard. I have thought so many times, she said softly, about what would have happened if you had ridden past, if you hadn't stopped. If you had simply, she shook her head. I was running out of options. I wasn't going to ride past, he said. You didn't know that then, she said. I think I did, he said. I think something in me knew the moment I saw you that I was not going to ride past. She looked at him. In the evening light, with the years of building between them, he was the same man who had stepped down from his horse in front of that closed feed store and offered her his hand to rise from the ground, the same steady gray eyes, the same quality of presence that was the single most reliable thing she had ever known. He was older now, the dark hair touched with silver at the temples, the lines around his eyes deeper, and she thought he was more himself than he had been then, if such a thing was possible, the years having worked on him the way good weather works on good timber, bringing out the grain, settling the substance. You gave me your plate, she said. He smiled. You needed it more. You went hungry yourself, she said. A little, he said. It was not a hardship. She reached out and took his hand. It was everything, she said quietly. It was the first thing that made me think there might be something worth trusting in the world. He turned his hand over and held hers properly, and they sat in the April evening, and James came running back from the yard with something cupped in his hands that he needed them to look at immediately. And Ruth set down her book to look too, and Isaac identified the something as a particularly large walking stick insect, and provided its approximate scientific standing. And Edna laughed at James's expression of betrayed wonder at learning the insect he had caught was not, in fact, a twig. And the laughter rang out across the porch and into the warm evening air. The years continued to unfold with the particular richness of a life that had been built on honest foundation. In 1891, Billy Prout married a young woman from Fredericksburg named Hannah Schraber, who had come to teach at the Redemption Creek School. And Edna organized the wedding celebration with the same competent thoroughness she brought to everything. And Isaac stood as one of the witnesses. And the partnership between the Monroes and Billy became the kind of thing that was not formal but was entirely real. The 4 adults and the children making a small community of their own within the larger one. James Monroe grew up to be a boy of enormous energy and genuine curiosity, who read everything he could find and argued about it at the supper table with both parents, to the poorly concealed delight of both parents. He had Isaac's steadiness and Edna's directness, and his own specific quality of enthusiastic engagement with the world that seemed to belong entirely to himself. And he was, by the time he was 8 years old, already talking to Billy about the soil chemistry of the North Pasture, with a focus that made Billy predict, correctly, that the boy would make something significant of himself. Ruth remained herself watchful and deep, slow to speak and sound in her judgments, with a gift for getting to the center of things that occasionally startled the adults around her with its precision. At 7 years old, she told her father, during a disagreement between him and Edna about the timing of a decision regarding an expansion of the cattle operation, exactly where each of them was miscommunicating and how to fix it, in 4 sentences, and then went back to her book. And Isaac and Edna looked at each other across the kitchen table with a mutual acknowledgement that they had produced something interesting. In the fall of 1892, a decade after the afternoon Isaac Monroe had stepped down from his horse in front of a closed feed store in Redemption Creek, he and Edna rode into town together on a fine, clear October morning. The hills gold and amber again, the air sharp and bright. The same country it had been that first day and entirely different. And he needed hardware, and she needed dry goods, and they had planned to have the midday meal at the Caldwell House's successor, a larger establishment called the Frontier Hotel, which had good food and a dining room with actual tablecloths. They sat at a table by the window as they had 10 years ago, though the window now looked out on a somewhat busier street, and ordered their meal, and Edna looked around the dining room with its tablecloths and its lamps and its cluster of local and traveling people, and then looked across at her husband with a small, quiet smile that contained a great deal. "Do you remember sitting here the first time?" she said. "I was just thinking about it," he said. "I was so careful," she said. "Trying not to look too hungry, trying to calculate whether you were someone I could trust, trying to—" She shook her head slightly. "I was exhausted," she said simply. "You didn't look exhausted," he said. "I was exhausted all the way through," she said. "I was just not willing to let it show." "That's not exactly the same as not being exhausted," he observed. "No," she agreed. "It was the least sustainable kind of fine." Mabel Pratt had long since retired and moved to live with her daughter in Austin, but the kitchen of the Frontier Hotel produced a meal that was competent and warm, and on this particular October day, tasted of 10 years and everything that had been made in them. They sat over their coffee for a long time afterward, talking with the ease of people who had no remaining performance to maintain, who were simply with each other in the most natural and complete way. He told her that he had been thinking about the North 40 and whether there was more they could do with it. Billy had some ideas about a different crop rotation that might work well. She told him she had received a letter from a woman she had met at the school association meeting in Careville, who was interested in establishing a similar teachers' correspondence network across 3 counties. They talked about James and whether the school in Redemption Creek was adequate to what he needed now, or whether they should think about the options further afield. They talked about Ruth and the drawing she had brought home last week that was, by any honest accounting, considerably more skilled than you would expect from a 7-year-old, and what that might mean for her future. They talked about small things and large things, the way people talk when a conversation is not a performance but a habit of connection, maintained over years and still alive. Riding home in the afternoon, with the low October sun throwing long golden light across the familiar hills and the smoke of their chimney visible from the far ridge, Isaac said, "Are you happy, Edna?" It was the same question he had asked on the way home from Fredericksburg after the wedding, years ago, when she had said she was so happy it frightened her a little. She looked at him now with those dark eyes that had measured him so carefully across a table 10 years ago and said, with the particular quality of someone who means something all the way down, "I am more than happy. I am exactly where I chose to be." He reached over from the saddle and took her hand on the reins, and they rode the last miles home together through the Golden Hill country afternoon. The homestead on the Caldera Road was waiting for them, as it always was, solid and dry and honest, the limestone pale in the afternoon light, the live oaks casting their long shadows, the smoke from Hannah's kitchen in Billy's cabin curling up alongside the smoke from their own. James came running from the barn the moment he saw them on the road, because he had something to tell his father about the mare, something that had happened with the foal, something urgent and wonderful. Ruth came to the porch and watched them approach with her characteristic composed attention, and when they dismounted she said, "Supper is ready. I set the table." "Thank you, Ruth," Edna said. "You were gone longer than usual," Ruth said, not accusatory, merely observational. "We sat over our coffee," Edna said. Ruth considered this. "Was it good coffee?" "Decent," Isaac said. "Ours is better," Ruth said, and went back inside. Edna looked at Isaac. He looked at Edna. They both laughed, the sound of it carried up and away on the evening air, over the limestone hills and the cedar and the wide open Texas sky. Inside, the kitchen was warm and the table was set, and James was already seated and talking, at considerable speed and volume, about the foal, and Hannah Pruitt had sent over a jar of her apple preserves, and the fire was going, and everything was exactly what it was, neither more nor less, which was, in the end, the very best kind of everything. Isaac Monroe had ridden into Redemption Creek on October afternoon in 1882 with a simple list of things to accomplish before dark. He had not accomplished any of them. He had found, instead, a woman sitting in the dust against a closed store, 2 days without food, holding herself together with the last dignified threads of her considerable will. He had given her the better plate and gone a little hungry himself, and thought nothing of it, because it was simply the obvious thing to do. And that, as it turned out, was how everything worth having in his life had begun, with a simple act of paying attention, and doing what the moment clearly required, and trusting that the rest would follow. It had followed. All of it had followed, the whole rich, impossible abundance of it. The house and the land and the work and the years, James's gray eyes and Ruth's quiet depth, Billy's laughter from the cabin across the yard, the sunflowers in August, the pecan harvest in October, the northern storms and the spring mornings, and the way the hill country sky looked on a clear December night with the moon full over the limestone ridges. And Edna Aldridge, who was Edna Monroe now, who had come to him hungry in every sense of the word, and had stayed not out of need but out of genuine choice, freely made with clear eyes and a heart that had taken its time and known what it was doing. He sat down at the supper table and passed the bread, and listened to James's account of the foal, and watched Ruth observe the proceedings from her chair with the considering expression she had been perfecting since birth, and felt Edna's hand brush his shoulder as she moved behind him to take her seat, and thought that the world was, in this hour, in this kitchen, in this particular and specific life they had built together, entirely and sufficiently good. Outside, the October stars were coming out above the hill country, one by one, in their ancient and reliable abundance. Inside, they ate together and the fire burned low, and the night came on, and the house held them.